Money, 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 money. Alright guys, gotta breeze through this quickly. We're gonna read once more again from Clash of Extremes, The Economic Origins of the Civil War by Marc Engall. Before I do so, I have to mention a couple things because this is probably rehashing for most of you guys, but just a couple things about money, okay? Way back in the day, way back centuries and centuries ago, okay? The conception of currency, okay, originated through people who owned gold, people who owned, lots of gold, okay? And back in those days, when somebody, fairly trustworthy in the community needed to borrow some money, they went to the gold owner, all right? And the gold owner basically wrote them a piece of paper saying that this piece of paper represents a very small fraction of the gold that I own. And so that note was as good as gold, right? Because it was actually backed by something. As many of you may know, here in the United States, even, our money once was at a time backed by gold, and then we downgraded and it was backed by silver, and now basically it is backed by nothing but the good faith and credit of the United States, or actually the Federal Reserve, who is not a part of the U.S. government, okay, but is a consortium of international bankers, right? And that's what our money is basically backed on now. And don't forget, we're about to go to cashless, and they're about to take cash off the table. The other thing I want to mention is that basically when money is taken out of circulation, okay, it generally does two things. It is a little bit of a hit on the typical, person, citizen, small business owners, so on and so forth. But at the same time, it usually tends to strengthen the dollar. When money is flooded into the system, conversely, as is with the situation of greenbacks, right? So from the Civil War, when money is flooded into the system, it temporarily does benefit the common person, small business owner, so on and so forth, but it also devalues the dollar. These are kind of basic economic concepts, okay? But like I've said before in other videos, grasping, concepts of banking, and let alone central banking and macroeconomics, this was new territory for me, 20 years ago or so. And I just want to review that. So we're going to start on page 342, but I'm going to skip around a little bit. After the war, and particularly after 1870, Republicans turned their attention to growing the northern economy. The pursuit of this goal led lawmakers to expand upon wartime legislation, create a flexible money supply, or as they say nowadays, a fungible money supply, reject Southern demands for assistance, and abandon the idealism that leavened party ideology before 1865. Increasingly, this party catered to the needs of big businesses that loomed ever larger in American society. Republicans built on the measures they had put in place during the Civil War, under the cover of the Civil War, if you will, more often helping the wealthy than the common folk. For example, the expansion of the national banking system enlarged a community of financiers closely tied to the government. The number of national banks grew from 467 in 1864 to 2,076 by 1875, and more than 7,000 by the early 20th century. I'll repeat that. The number of national banks grew from 467 in 1864 to 2,076 by 1875. Now try and tell this guy that money in banking didn't have anything to do with this at all. And, that the greenbacks weren't, introduced during the Civil War, right? And the income tax introduced during the Civil War. Try and tell this guy that money had nothing to do with this. Please, please. Republicans also encouraged industrialists by keeping high wartime tariff rates in place until the 20th century. Even the party's land policy, with the Homestead Act as a centerpiece, had mixed results. Although thousands took up free tracts, latecomers found that the best land was in private hands. I'm going to skip around a little bit. The Pacific Railroad Act, which Republicans had pushed through in 1862 during the war. Again, many of these measures, as is always, are pushed under the cover, under the fog of war. Do you hear me? Led to the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 and produced fortunes for well-placed investors. As a track was laid, The act transferred millions of acres to the Union and Central Pacific Railroads. The irony of bestowing these fiefdoms on corporations while denying freedmen 40-acre plots was not lost on radical Republicans or Southern blacks. Anthony Wayne, who had been a slave in Texas, asked, whilst Congress appropriated land by the millions acres to pet railroad schemes, did they not aid poor Anthony and his people starving and in rags? The answer was no. For many observers, the injustice of these grants was only compounded by the extraordinary corruption that accompanied the building of the railroad. The directors of the Union Pacific created a company, the Crédit Mobilier of America, and gave it the exclusive right to lay track. This new enterprise, owned by the railroad's inner circle, profited handsomely by charging the Union Pacific exorbitant rates and drawing on government subsidies, i.e., Crédit Mobilier was basically a shell bank. I'm going to skip ahead to a little bit on page 344, getting back to some of the concepts I was mentioning earlier. Beginning right after the war and continuing until the end of the century, the Republican Party carved out a middle path between the banking interests of the East and the poor farmers of the South and West. Leading this majority was John Sherman, head of the Senate Finance Committee and later Secretary of the Treasury. Sherman fought a war on two fronts. He condemned the cautious bankers whose spokesman after the war was Treasury Secretary Hugh McCulloch. McCulloch sought to contract the money supply by sharply reducing the number of greenbacks in circulation. Sherman resisted the plan, At the same time, When Johnson vetoed this bill, Republicans reaffirmed their position. An act to strengthen the public credit of the United States became the first measure Ulysses S. Grant signed after entering office, the first real measure that he signed after becoming president. I'm going to completely skip page 345, moving just a little bit into 346. After 1870, the Republican Party increasingly gravitated towards big business. The defection of abolitionists who despaired of ever reforming the South, along with the revolt of liberal Republicans who were angered by the spread of corruption, left the party in the hands of those whose chief concern was encouraging the growth of the industrial state. Since the earliest days of the Republic, political parties had cultivated rich men. What was new in this era was the unprecedented wealth and the power of captains of industry and the influence they gained in the political process. Mention names like Jay Gould, railroad tycoon, oil baron John D. Rockefeller, Chauncey Depew, who oversaw affairs for the Vanderbilt family. I'm going to skip to page 347. This work argues that more than any other concern, the evolution of the northern and southern economies, or the divergence of northern and southern economies, explains the Civil War. During the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, north-south patterns of trade, the strong growth of the Cotton Kingdom, and parties rooted in class rather than geographical divisions kept the country together despite contentious sectional issues. After mid-century, however, the rise of the Great Lakes economy, spreading westward, of course, with the spread of anti-slavery sentiment transformed the North. Such an economic interpretation is hardly fashionable. Americans, like the citizens of most nations, prefer to view their history as a series of comforting myths. Thus, most commentators contend that the American Revolution pitted freedom-loving colonists against the tyrannical British. Similarly, many writers argue that the Civil War was all about freeing the slaves. World War I was fought to make the world safe for democracy. Same goes for World War II. These myths endure because they portray Americans favorably. As this account makes clear, Republicans were not simply concerned with fostering northern growth, they also abhorred slavery. Might I add again and remind, they didn't really give a darn about real enfranchisement or equal rights. That came, a good century later. Nor does this show why Republicans strongly supported the industrial state but were willing to abandon African Americans in the 1870s. Ultimately, myths are luxuries that no nation can afford. Economics, more than moral high ground concerns, produced the Civil War, like I've said before. And like I've said before, this book did not introduce that many new concepts to me. I was already on board with most of the things that we've recently went over. Again, his focus on the Great Lakes economy, I think, was a real great contribution, and I definitely learned a bit there. But there you have it, guys. This is probably the last video. I always say these kind of things, but probably the last video I'll do from that book, but I would implore people to think about it deeply. Economics and technology dictate social patterns, not moral high grounds and myths. Get that into your heads. Think about it some more. I'll see you until then.